Everything is awesome. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 45 of the iPhreaks show. This week on our panel we have Ben Sherman.
Hello from Houston.
James Zuber.
I just spent all week removing all the go-to fails from my code. I thought it was like a good pattern or something.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. And this week we have a special guest, and that is Jonas Budelmann.
Hello from New Zealand.
So you want to introduce yourself really quickly for the folks who don't know who you are?
Yeah, I'm an iOS dev, and I've been working on iPhone and iPad apps pretty much since the SDK came out, and just love what I'm doing and have made a few GitHub projects. And
Cool. Are you the guy behind the Masonry Pod?
Yep, that's one of the projects I've released on GitHub.
Cool. You want to talk about that for a minute? Just kind of explain. Ben brought up before the show that everybody loves auto layout.
Yeah, the auto layout bomb. I guess it's one of those things that divides people because it's such a different way of doing things, and you can pull your hair out quite often when something goes wrong with it or it doesn't quite work the way you want it to. So it's good and bad, definitely, has its ups and downs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How is it so different from using something like Interface Builder, or does Interface Builder now use auto layout? I
guess in Xcode 4, auto layout support for Interface Builder was quite rudimentary, let's say. But now in Xcode 5, it's a lot better, so you can do a lot of things and preview what your auto layout constraints will look like in different screen sizes, and it'll do a lot more for you to help you kind of solve issues that you're having with auto layout. Having said that, I predominantly use auto layout in code, which is a different approach again, and the reason why I created Masonry.
So Masonry just makes it prettier? Is it just a nicer API on top of auto layout, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. So I guess Apple has to provide us with the very basic frameworks, and then I think it's up to third-party developers to put nice APIs around kind of the very low-level generic APIs that Apple provides. So things like AF networking, while they enhance a lot of what Apple is doing, a lot of it is just providing nicer APIs and addressing more the common use case.
So I tried using auto layout with Xcode 4 in code, and I ended up running away screaming from the pain. I understand it's gotten better. Can you tell us what the difference is between doing at least walk us through what it's like creating auto layouts in code, and tell us how kind of Masonry does things better?
Yeah, I guess you've got two options when you create auto layout in code. So one of them is the most low-level API, which is NS layout constraint, and you create a constraint with item, and then you have to pass all the different things you need for that constraint. So this method actually has 7 parameters to it. So that's quickly becomes unreadable. For one constraint, you need to call a method with 7 different parameters. So if you only need 2 of those, you can imagine it becomes quite verbose. The other option is to use visual format language, which is an ASCII type string which you pass in, which represents your auto layout constraint that you want to create. And it's a bit more visual, but some people find that quite hard to understand. You have to translate all your views and give them names and pass those in as well. And it also returns you an array of constraints. So if you later want to remove just one of those constraints or animate just one of them, you have to sort through that array, and it's quite hard to determine which constraint relates to which part of that ASCII string that you passed in.
I think the auto layout visual format language is definitely preferable than just creating the sort of the object model from scratch, because it's way verbose. If you imagine all the things you need to specify when dragging a line from one view to the edge and specifying that it's a horizontal spacing constraint or whatever, doing that in code is quite wordy. I think the visual format language is pretty nice once you understand it, but I think the problem is it's not discoverable at all. In fact, I know a lot of people don't even know about it.
Yes.
So, yeah. I mean, given that, and that you can do a lot with the visual format language, what made you sort of still want more flexibility or expressiveness with some tool, which ended up being Masonry?
I guess there's a couple of reasons. One, because I'm doing all my layout in code and all the view. I don't use interface builder. That means I want to do all the animations using auto layout, and doing that with visual format language is quite hard. And I also preferred not to use a kind of a string-based method for laying out, for creating my constraints.
So how does Masonry make this better?
Masonry uses the kind of object model way of creating your constraint, but it reads like a sentence. So, for example, the syntax for creating a constraint relating left to the right of another view, you'd say make left equal to other view dot right. So if you come back to that in a few months, you can read it and understand what that constraint is doing. Whereas if you come back to one of the other low-level APIs, it's quite hard to get your mind around what that constraint is creating and what it's actually doing. So it's a bit easier, I think, to read, which definitely increases like getting your head around the constraints and understanding what they're doing.
Okay, it sounds like this is sort of fluent interface for doing the constraints. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. Yeah.
I guess it definitely helps with making it discoverable for other people, just to see what you could just chain things together to see what operations are even available.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess it also gives you the option of, if you don't need the multiplier or the constant attributes of a constraint, you can leave them out. So it's only what you need and nothing more kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very cool. Yeah, I'm looking on the GitHub page, and it has an example where you're passing a constraint, but the code actually reads out pretty clean. You know, make top equal to whatever top with offset. So I think that's a very simple way of explaining what you're trying to do and making it very readable. So yeah, I can agree. I can see why this would be valuable.
Yeah, I guess definitely readability was my main goal with creating Masonry. Just to make it easier for someone else to look at the constraints I'm creating, or to look at someone else's constraints. I can pretty much understand them, just read them out and get my head around them pretty quick.
Do you have any apps out there that you're using this with?
I'm currently working on a project at the moment, but it's under NDA, but that's using auto layout through Masonry.
Oh, very nice. I love those. I'm working on, I can't tell you.
It's so amazing, your mind will be blown. Now, does Masonry expose anything that's not available from Interface Builder, or not easy to do?
I guess it has a few kind of composite constraints, which basically lets you create multiple at once. Say if you want to make all the edges equal to a certain view, match it exactly, you can do that using kind of one line of code rather than creating 4 constraints for left, right, bottom, top, which is quite handy in terms of cutting down and also just increasing that readability again.
So were there any design decisions that were hard for you to make, or was this mostly pretty straightforward as far as how you wanted it to come out?
Yeah, I guess one of the, most divisive design decisions was it's kind of breaking convention in terms of the way it uses the dot notation. So it almost doesn't look like Objective-C because you're using round brackets. And as you guys would know, when you're writing Objective-C, when you're calling methods and stuff, you use square brackets. And the reason for that is if you're using square brackets, then you get into basically you'd have to name all the method parameters that you want to call. So you're losing the benefit of chainability.
I think you've alienated every longtime Mac developer. You've got dot notation, you got auto layout, and you got CocoaPods. I think they've already left the show. If Andrew is here, I don't know what would happen.
Can you write this with the square bracket notation, or is there a reason why you shouldn't?
Well, I mean, I think you'd have the square bracket explosion on the left-hand side, and you'd have to, right, so that every time you want to chain one, you got to add another wrapping pair. And if you're like a Lisp fan, maybe you don't care, but It just really, really hurts the readability when you do that. I do like how, even though this isn't really necessarily Objective-C style, it is isolated to a block, which yields a builder object. Yeah. And so you really don't need, I also have to applaud your use of prefixes for the categories. So you start off making constraints with a specific view, and that is with a make constraints method call. But that one has to be prefixed with your MAS prefix, so it doesn't collide with potentially anything else that does similar things. But then once you're inside of that block, the majority of these function calls all come from MAS constraint maker, which since they all sort of yield the same object, I guess it's every operation still returns the builder, so you can chain them together. Then you end up having an easy way to, this is definitely familiar to Java developers because there's a lot of APIs like this in Java, and .NET had similar. I would say there's lots of libraries out there that do similar things in a fluent way. Some of them being ports of Java code. But I don't know how familiar this is to Objective-C developers because this is inherently sort of cumbersome with square bracket syntax. So even though it's different, it is isolated to the one block. So it's kind of like, oh, okay, I'm in this new mode where I'm going to chain together some things. And you compare this 2 lines of code in your example with the, 30 in the 30 lines of code of how to do it with just NS layout constraint. I'll take the shorter one, please.
And I guess going to your point about you're creating the constraints within that block, it also helps because that all those constraints are related to one view, whereas when you're creating it through visual format language or the lower level syntax, it becomes hard to tell which constraints relate to which view. So that's also improves the readability.
I noticed that when you're sort of storing a reference to these constraints, these are your own constraint class instead of NS layout constraint. Is that a subclass of NS layout constraint, or how is that different?
No, it's using composition instead of inheritance. So the actual constraint is contained within that object as a property, and that allows us, because at any point within that chain, you could save off that reference. So it needs to wrap that NS layout constraint rather than inherit from it.
Okay. So then if you want to do things like, at WWDC, Apple showed off an example where you have this, nice auto layout driven interface, but then there's this new sort of view that comes into place somewhere, and you need to be able to, reshuffle your interface based on this new element that you're adding in. And so they showed off the ability to create a constraint and animate it, so that you could say, okay, make room for the new instance, and you can even make outlets for your NS layout constraints. Can you do the same thing with this system? I suppose you wouldn't be using Interface Builder quite so much, but I'm just wondering about animating constraints or dynamically adjusting the constraints after you've created them.
Yeah, so the main thing that you can change on a constraint is called the constant, funnily enough. So that's quite easy to change with Masonry. And I guess the other thing you would want to do when you animate is uninstall a constraint and add a new one. So those things have been taken care of, and you can do those things while you're animating.
So if you're writing your constraints in code, what is debugging like? Are you just basically firing up the simulator and checking to see if everything lays out the way you expect it?
Yeah. So, and often you'll come across kind of the outputs in the console, which will tell you if you've got too many constraints or not enough constraints. And one of the things that Masonry will help you with in debugging is you can assign a name to each of your views. So instead of getting memory reference, so it'd tell you UI label 0x37my, you can say that's the message label, or that's the header view. So you can give names to those constraints, and they'll come out in the console debugging messages. Like, for example, one of them tells you you're unable to simultaneously satisfy constraints, and it'll give you nice names for all your different views rather than memory references.
Oh, that's very cool. Is there any custom error reporting from Masonry, or is it all the stock built-in stuff?
Yeah, that's all using kind of custom debugging names for each constraint. So it uses the built-in Apple error reporting, but when Apple goes, give me the debug message for this particular constraint, Masonry overrides that and provides a new message with names, and you can name the constraints and also the views to give you a bit more idea of what's going wrong and where it's going wrong.
Oh, very cool.
So what has the usage been? I noticed that the GitHub repository has quite a number of stars and forks. Have you heard of this being used in any sort of major applications, or, what has the general response from the community been?
Yeah, it's been really good. I was quite surprised that it seems to be used by a number of apps, and also just the fact that the syntax is maybe breaking a little with convention, but people seem to have taken it up really well, and I've gotten a lot of tweets saying it's helped them understand auto layout or made auto layout easier for them. So that's quite encouraging, and it's been great to get pull requests and contributions from the community. So that's always nice to know people are using it and want to improve and help develop it further. So it's been great.
I noticed that, I mentioned applauding your use of the prefix for category methods, because there's quite a few category methods that it adds to views. Then I noticed in the documentation that you have the shorthand define, so that if you want to run with scissors, or if you want to, live on the wild side, I guess you could turn that off. Could you talk about how that mechanic is pulled off? Because, it depends on define being set somewhere in the, somewhere at compile time, right?
Yeah, so by default, all the shorthand is off. When you turn it on, you can still use the prefix version, but all the prefix versions will, when you call the unprefix version, it'll just forward that message on. And that's just done. So in the header, if you define that shorthand, then when it goes and imports all the Masonry files, it will switch on those using a if-def statement.
And are you using like NS forward invocation, or is this, is there some metaprogramming at work here?
No, it's much more manual than that. So it's using a macro to forward all those different methods on.
Yeah, I think that's, it's technically very cool, and it's good for the people who really can't stand the prefixes, but I would still recommend just to live with the prefixes. It's safer, especially since the attribute names that you have for all of your view attributes, left, top, right, bottom, leading, trailing, width, height, center X, center Y, baseline, any one of those could easily be something that Apple decides to define later on, and theirs might just be a float.
You should create a new pod, make it really popular, and just throw that stuff in there. Just to show people.
You mean like 320?
You can call it a framework.
Yeah, I think it's, becoming more widely accepted, but there's so many pods out there that I'm like, oh, this is a cool idea, but I'm probably never going to use it because they didn't prefix their methods. There was a good NS hipster that I should, I'll save it for the picks then.
Awesome. Do you guys have any other questions or thoughts?
I'm kind of out of questions. This looks like pretty straightforward auto layout code, just a lot easier to read and write. So I'm looking forward to trying this out in an app to see. I also am baffled by auto layout a lot of times, and sometimes I will rage click that checkbox in Interface Builder to turn it off because it's doing something that I don't understand, and sometimes you just need to get things done. And the old way with auto layout turned on with springs and struts is so much of an easier model to understand. And there's definitely cases where you have to write code to handle like, oh, this label now needs to be larger or smaller, depending on the language or whatever. But in lots of cases, I enjoy writing the sort of system of equations that you would get by manually setting frames And as long as you use descriptive variable names and constants, it's really also pretty expressive. So I'm still not just, I don't dislike the manual layout of views in code. But certainly if I'm using auto layout, I will definitely look at something like this to make my life a little bit easier.
Cool.
Yeah, with the rumored kind of larger screens coming, I think this fall or whenever they're coming, I think auto layout becomes a little more reasonable.
It was kind of funny, you know, Apple had the iPhone 4 and 4S, and then around that time they said, hey, an auto layout, and wink wink, you should be using it, wink wink. And then the next year at WWDC, you know, they're like, okay, and iPhone 5, and by the way, we told you last year you should be using auto layout. So had you listened, your apps would probably be laid out correctly.
I think also the variable text sizes helps a lot with that. So if a user sets their text size to larger or smaller, your interface can adapt easier if it's, you know, constraint based.
Yeah, and if you're localizing to German, then you need to add like 40 characters to every word and see how your app lays out.
So are there instances where you would want to use just regular auto layout instead of the Masonry Pod? Or does this solve all the problems for all the people?
I guess in the project that I've been working on, I haven't come across the need to drop down to kind of the more low-level Apple frameworks. So I think you can, if you adopt it, it's better to stick to one method rather than mix all the different options within one code base, so you've got some consistency. So if you're going to go with one way, you may as well kind of stick with it and go with it.
Yeah, makes sense. Are there any features that you're looking at adding to Masonry, or is it pretty well done until Apple updates the underlying structure that you're built on?
So I'm always kind of open to any features that the community throws out there in terms of if they need more convenience or if they have an idea of how it could be easier to use or how it could build on auto layout a bit more. But at the moment, I think it's covering most of pretty much all of what you can do with the low level framework, but in a more readable way. So I think it's built out quite a bit. So until Apple, you know, adds more features, and we need to get parity with that and support those features in Masonry, I don't think there's too much more to do on it.
Yeah, one thing I thought I like about this is you've got properties for the different priorities that are set by the system, which are kind of hard to find in Interface Builder. I end up just throwing in numbers, create my own random scheme, and end up forgetting what my different priorities are. But I like the priority high, priority medium, priority low, so you can just chain it on your constraints. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think as well, what you said earlier about using constants, that definitely helps a lot as well. You can, if you define all your padding as a constant and then you can pass it into Masonry, you can change it in one place. And that's one of the benefits of doing it in code. You can set one variable and then all your layout will change depending on if you change that padding from 20 to 40.
Yeah, definitely. I've spent a couple days this week trying to get pixel perfect images to line up correctly. And yeah, you do a lot of setting your variable, setting your floats for your offsets, and how much past the actual image does this image go. It's transparent that you don't see. So setting constants, very helpful.
It's definitely helpful, and it's wordy and tedious or whatever, but I mean, you're at that moment, you're burying your head in the problem of laying out your views, which I think is a plus. When you're just sort of clicking and dragging around lines, perhaps your brain isn't quite so engaged in exactly what you need for that layout. So I think that, the deliberate hand coding is, can be thought of as a benefit. The other thing I really like about doing it in code is that you can diff it really easily. So if you accidentally fat finger something, you don't have like a merge error that happens in like a storyboard, which you probably never find, right?
Yeah.
Those are the types of things which, like you would being able to diff two versions of a file and say, oh, okay, this is, why the layout is messed up because I accidentally set this to 25 instead of 30 or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, there are definitely downsides to doing an interface builder. However, it certainly demos well. If you know what you want, you can certainly click and drag faster than you can type them out.
Yeah. I guess you can mix Interface Builder with Masonry as well. So if you want to lay everything out in Interface Builder and then later you could use Masonry just to add those constraints that maybe you need to do programmatically, or, if you're inserting a view depending on a button click, you can do that using Masonry and keep your main layout in Interface Builder.
Awesome. Are there any other questions or comments, or should we get to the picks?
I think we're ready.
I'm good. I'm ready to auto layout.
All right, cool. Well, James, what are your picks?
So I have 2 picks today. One, so we talked about Masonry being kind of a instance of the builder pattern. There was a blog post from 2 or 3 years back that helped me kind of understand how to do a builder type thing in Objective-C. So if you're listening to our podcast and wondering, what are they talking about, this fluent and builder type stuff, I found a good blog post that kind of explains it pretty simply. It's called The Builder Pattern in Objective-C. It's by Eric Dornenberg, which I probably misspoke. My second pick is a whiskey pick. So for my birthday a week or so ago, my dad gave me a bottle of Russell's Reserve bourbon, which is very fantastic. Not terribly expensive, but maybe a little bit more than your average bourbon. It's one of the Wild Turkey ones, which I haven't really done that much of. I kind of stick to the Jim Beam. I drink a lot of Knob Creek. But Russell's Reserve, very good. It's kind of a rye forward bourbon, so there's good rye in there, good rye spice, but a lot of the stuff that you like in a good bourbon. So I definitely recommend. Check out Russell's Reserve. Those are my picks.
All right, Ben, what are your picks?
Okay, so I alluded to my NS Hipster pick from earlier on namespacing, and I think it's just required reading for Objective-C developers, especially library authors. We're building software that will end up in somebody's pocket and possibly never touched for many years. And software moves fast. So it's important because Objective-C lacks namespaces, it's important to use prefixes where you might collide in global scope. And that's where all of our handy dandy prefixes go or come from. So anyway, go read that article and practice safe Objective-C library development. The next one is a movie pick. I recently rewatched True Grit. I did see it in theaters and I just watched it again. That's just such a fantastic movie. I really like it. It's full of quotes too. I was quoting it on Twitter repeatedly while watching it. The next pick is it's like a static site generator, but it's more for non-programmers, I would say, called Cactus for Mac. And it makes it easy to create a single page portfolio or gallery or blog. And Cactus I believe it was designed by some of the people who used to work at Sofa, which is kind of like a famous development company that got sort of absorbed by Facebook. And now those guys they've done their 2 years or whatever, and now they're off working on cool new things. And anyway, I like just the overall experience is really good. I don't have a site in mind for doing this, but the next static site I need to build, I'll probably try it out using Cactus. And then last one, I will also do a whiskey pick. I'm not really a bourbon connoisseur. I like Scotch. So a friend of mine recommended Noah's Mill bourbon, and I found it in my local Specs liquor store, and it is super good. I made some old fashions with it. Only problem is it's 5,000 proof bourbon. It's really, really potent. I don't know the actual proof, but anyway, it'll sneak up on you, but good for old fashions. So those are my picks.
Awesome. I've got a bunch of picks. Last week, my wife and I went to the St. George area Parade of Homes, which was it was a lot of fun. St. George is a city in southern Utah. It's about a couple hours from Las Vegas. Anyway, it was fun. We saw a bunch of houses, and we get ideas for things that we would like in our house. So anyway, I really enjoy going every year with her, and we usually wind up going around her birthday. Her birthday was on Sunday. So terrific and a lot of fun. I was also doing some work for a client. We're building an application that he's about to launch, and he was looking for a theme, and we had built everything on Twitter Bootstrap version 3. And we were looking for an admin theme for him, and I found one on startbootstrap.com. And so I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes as well. And then finally, I've been reading a couple of books. They're really short books, and I'm almost halfway through Running Lean by Ash Maurya, and he kind of takes the lean startup ideas and gives you a little bit more practical advice on them. I recommend reading the Lean Startup book first so you get a real good idea of what it's about, and then go read Running Lean. The other book I read was Tribes by Seth Godin. I'd read it before, but every time I read it, I'm kind of inspired to be a little bit more of a rebel. So anyway, so those are my picks. Let's hear some picks from Jonas.
My first pick is the Mantle framework for iOS and Mac. So if you're doing a lot of API calls in your application and you need to parse all your JSON models into Objective-C, this is really handy and lets you do that in a more structured, clean way. And my other picks are, I just recently got a new MacBook because my previous one decided to blow up on me. And while you're doing that, I guess you explore different apps and maybe you refresh some that you haven't used in a while and you look at other options. So instead of going for the Photoshop and Illustrator, this time around I've gone for Pixelmator and Sketch, which I've found very cool. Maybe a little bit more lightweight than Illustrator and Photoshop. You can't do 100% of the things you can do, but I'm not a designer. I just need to crop a few things or resize a few things or save to different formats. So for that and a little bit of very basic image touching, those have pretty much fulfilled my needs at a fraction of the cost. So that's definitely worth checking out if you need to do basic image editing on Mac.
Awesome. We'll be doing a book club book,
Functional Reactive Programming by Ash Furrow.
And we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And remind you to start reading it so that we can talk about it here in a few weeks. And I guess other than that, we'll wrap up. Thanks for coming, Jonas.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, we'll catch y'all next week.